Well, hello, and welcome to this talk on shamanism, the biological basis of an evolved healing capacity. In this presentation, I'm going to combine some of the things I've had to say over time about the nature of shamanic healing with some new ideas that I've developed related to how it is that this capacity evolved. And the overall point of this lecture is to sort of contextualize it in the context of what is shamanism from a cross-cultural perspective, and then use that as a basis for understanding something about the origins of shamanic healing and hominid ritual, looking at the similarities with the way in which group ritualizations take place among the chimpanzees. And as a broader context and understanding how these capacities evolved over time. But I want to make a quick shift to, are shamans mentally ill? And take this old stream of thought into a new context in which we look at how it may evoke a kind of, on one hand, psychotic reaction, and on the other hand, stimulate endogenous healing responses. And I'm going to be sort of oriented to this notion of a pivotal mental state in which the right kind of structuring leads to healthy responses and the wrong kind of structuring leads to a breakdown. From there, I'm going to look at the biogenetic origins of shamanic healing in terms of a sickness and healing response. The idea being that what we have as part of our innate capacities is this innate set of systems to respond to stress. And part of these responses have to do with ritual technologies, particularly those related to mimesis, the mimetic suite, and how it is that things such as dancing and singing and chanting provide intrinsic healing properties, as well as inducing altered states of consciousness that also have intrinsic healing principles. And so I'm going to try to wrap up by proposing that the bases of shamanistic therapies involve ritual, which stimulates certain kinds of innate responses, altered states, which allow for their further expansion, expression, and the spirit world, which becomes a symbolic modality through which we're able to then use our beliefs and expectations to stimulate certain kinds of endogenous responses, particularly those related to our innate social intelligences. I already know I have way too much to cover here in the 45 minutes I'm going to use. At some points, I'm going to skip over some of these slides or be very brief with them. The first thing that I want to say is that the idea of shamanism was around long before Iliade, going back more than 200 years. When expeditions into Russia brought to the Western world the concept of the shaman. And across time, it became a cross-cultural idea that, in essence, proposed, instead of arbitrary bases to religion, there was a remarkably similar set of ritual practices found in cultures around the world, not just in Siberia and Asia, but in Australia, the Pacific, Africa, the Americas, and perhaps even ancient Europe. And Iliade popularized this notion in the mid-20th century with his book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, in which he proposed that the idea of a shaman as someone who enters into ecstasy to communicate with spirits on behalf of a community was something found in cultures around the world. Now, this limited definition of Iliades ultimately led to confusion because I would contend that this is a human universal, although shamanism is not. Iliade offered other features about shamans, the nighttime, overnight experiences, the out-of-body experiences in particular, healing through things such as soul recovery and combating sorcerers, as well as ideas about animal transformation and ultimately various forms of healing and altered states of consciousness. But what we see in the 20th century is also a counter response. Are these characteristics really found cross-culturally? Or is it just in a few Siberian societies? Is shamanism just a modern invention from a misunderstanding, or is it a transcendent reality? There's a precedent for particular kind of features found cross-culturally. The lifestyle of foragers is remarkably the same around the world, even the family forms and kinship system that they have. So if all these other features of hunter-gatherers can be cross-cultural, can religion? Well, if we treat religion as some kind of arbitrary cultural belief, we're easily led to ignore that aspect. But if we treat religion as something intrinsic to human nature, then we ought to be able to use methods to determine if, in fact, the phenomena exist. And this is what I did. I decided that the scientific way to resolve this question was through cross-cultural research. And the cross-cultural research I did as my doctoral dissertation, eventually published as Shamans, Priests, and Witches, was a cross-cultural study based upon the standard cross-cultural sample, 47 different societies, 115 different practitioners in these societies that I characterized with more than 98 variables. This is available on ResearchGate. And what's really, I think, most important out of this study for our purposes today is the notion that using cluster analysis, I derived a number of different types of practitioners. Now, these different types I've labeled with common terms: shaman, shaman healer, medium, priest, sorcerers. But the classification was not based upon them being called that. The classification was based upon shared characteristics. And this gave me different types. Of particular focus here is going to be the shaman, and also noteworthy, the distinctions of healer and medium. The shaman healers were a transitional group, which I won't talk about today, other than to say that they showed changes due to the fact that they're found in agricultural societies. Now, based upon this, I got a very complex model here, and I'm not going to talk about it all, but to say that some societies had one type of practitioner, a shaman or another member of the healer complex. Others had two, where a priest is now present as well. Some had three, where a medium or sorcerer witch, and then finally a healer, a medium, a sorcerer witch, and a priest, corresponding to different levels of socio-political complexity, and also involving different kinds of selection function entailments. How were they selected for the role, and what did they do? And the practitioners I'm going to focus on today, the shamans and the shamanistic healers, shared features of using altered states of consciousness as the basis for selection, and their functions involved healing and divination. So if you want to follow up more on this more recent analyses that I've done about the social predictors of these different practitioners and their biogenetic bases, it's available in this article. But what I'm going to talk about today really is more focused on the shamans. So what the cross-cultural research showed me is that this group that I called shamans, social universal features of shamans, which is to say they're characteristics associated with shamans in the societies where they're found. They're hunter-gatherer groups. They do nighttime rituals with the entire community together, chanting, drumming, and dancing. They have altered states as central visionary experiences, including soul flight, transformation into animals, death and rebirth experiences, and part of their formation, they actually learn how to control these animals, that they're capable of transforming into the animals. And as practitioners, they heal soul loss, they heal sorcery, they heal attacks from spirits, they engage in various forms of divination, and they perform hunting magic, loosely a metaphor for the idea. They help hunters find animals to capture, kill, to eat. And they engage in malevolent acts, sorcery. They're thought to steal souls, to send spirits to attack people, to perform sorcery, to harm others. Now, the healing principles begin with shamanic formation. Becoming a shaman was seen as a condition of healing oneself, moving from a condition of being afflicted by the spirits who demand the formation as a shaman to becoming a wounded healer and acquiring the capacity to heal because they were once ill and healed themselves. They heal through a vision quest in which a primary objective is to encounter and develop relationships with spirit allies. And during this period of formation, normally a vision quest alone out in the wilderness, they engage in fasting, sexual abstinence, social isolation. They engage in a variety of austerities, sometimes, beating themselves or cutting off parts of fingers or letting blood. And this leads to an initiatory death experience, normally thought to involve being attacked, killed, and devoured by animals, but then they're reborn through the powers of the same animals that reconstruct them. and incorporate themselves into the shaman's body as a source of power. And the aspects of healing that are part of this experience include what we would call astral projection or out-of-body experiences, something like near-death experiences, or the shamanic magical flight. So what are the healing processes here? Well, a central issue was recovering the soul of someone that had been lost, stolen, frightened out of their body, taken by another sorcerer, requiring a journey to find out where it is, who has it, and capture it and bring it back. A major aspect of shamanic healing also involved object extraction, sucking on the body, engaging in manipulations of the body, what anthropologists often refer to as a sleight of hand. That was the underlying basis through which the object was not actually extracted from the body, but instead surreptitiously removed from the shaman's mouth and said, this is what I just sucked out of you. This is what's causing your illness. The healing processes also involved a variety of encounters in the spirit world, in visions during the healing, but in the shamanic formation, in the hallucinations that appeared in illness and in dreams. But encountering the spirits that might cause illness, that were set by another sorcerer, in essence, combating those sorcerers to get the soul back or move the attacking spirits, returning the darts that were sent. This was all part of the dynamic of healing. But there was another aspect of healing that wasn't considered to be the healing power in most cases, but which has to be seen as the broader context. And this was a healing through a dramatic enactment, a case of drumming and dancing and engaging in chanting and singing and imitation of struggles with the spirits. This all too was part of the context in which the shaman was engaged in healing. So how can we understand all these in contemporary terms? I won't try to address all of these, but I'm primarily going to focus on the aspects of enactment and engagement with the spirits as the tools for both self-healing and healing clients. So these shamanistic healers, not just the shamans, but the shaman healers, and mediums, ritually entered altered states of consciousness to engage the spirit world. And I see these as being the core of what we have to explain, how the visions, the dreams, the spirit visitations, and the spirit quest, which were the basis for selection for the shaman, were expanded through ritual alterations of consciousness to produce healing of the individual. Now, just briefly here, I want to emphasize the shamans are different from mediums. Mediums predominantly women, possession ASCs, indications of physiological imbalances manifested in tremors, convulsions, seizures, amnesia, dissociation, and healing practices involving exorcism and sacrifices, and ultimately protection, rather than bringing your soul back, for instance. And the healers found in complex agricultural societies where they pay for their training, also acquiring political and economic power, little engagement with the altered states, a lack of direct communication with spirits, and healing through spells and formulas and exorcism, providing some kind of protection for the people, and doing so in private client rituals, not in the kinds of collective rituals typical of shamanism. So I've described the shamans, the shaman healers, the mediums, the healers, the priests, and the witches in this other recent article, where I tried to expand our understanding from the more limited data that was available in my cross-cultural study to the broader context of the anthropological inquiry into religious healing. So where does shamanic healing come from? I elaborate on a number of these ideas in several publications available on ResearchGate and in my book on shamanism, a biopsychosocial paradigm of consciousness and healing. I contend that we can see the deep roots of shamanic ritual by looking at the commonalities that we have with ape ritualizations, particularly chimpanzees, that involve nighttime community displays that protect the group through these conspicuous displays by the alpha male, charging bipedal displays, vocalization, drumming on trees and tree trunks. I contend that these are where the deep roots of our shamanic practices come from, and that in this context, altered states of consciousness are an important part of what is produced, sort of as a side effect of the shamanic ritual activities, particularly the drumming and the dancing, and that these altered states provide a mechanism for the elicitation of a variety of innate cognitive processes, innate intelligences that are manifested in singing and dancing, mimetic suite, as well as in spirits and in access to intuitive modules. I also contend that all of these together, the ritual, the altered states, and the access to innate cognitive modules, elicit a variety of endogenous healing processes that have to do with the endogenous opioid system, as well as placebo and hypnotic responses, and others that I'll add today. So what I've had to say in the past is represented here in shamanism. What I have to say for most of today comes from there, and then some of these new ideas about endogenous healing responses. And I want to take off from the question of, are shamans mentally ill? And this has been a long-standing perspective going back to the initial discovery of these dramatic kinds of performances that led 19th century scholars to often assert that the shaman was basically mentally ill, manifesting hysteria, schizophrenia, psychoses, other conditions. But also, since the late 19th century, and certainly with Shirkogorov's book, The Psychomental Complex of the Tungus, there's been a counter view that eventually became the prevailing view. And that was one in which the idea that the shaman may exhibit some conditions related to some kind of mental instability, intense excitement, shouting, sometimes, followed by periods of stupor or even amnesia, but that this was not a pathological behavior, that it was a normative behavior, and perhaps even normal in the context of Tungus culture. This was what was expected of their healers, that they engage in these kinds of performances. And rather than being seen as a kind of out of control mental illness, it was seen as a kind of performance that conveyed important information about the psychodynamics of the patient, perhaps expressing fears and concerns, or the kinds of influences that others may be having on the patient. So this dramatic performance was a communicative interaction, and it wasn't characteristic of a dysfunctional person, but rather a powerful healer who had the capacity to not only provide crucial healing services for the community, but also enact their cosmological system, manage ecological relations in terms of taboos, as well as provide a variety of other social roles in addition to being a therapeutic resource. So by the 20th century, late 20th century, there was a general impression that even though there was this association of shamanism with very unusual behavior, it wasn't that the shaman was basically pathological. Roger Walsh was one of the people that made this point, Richard Knoll. But at the same time, there's this persisting notion that, there's something similar between what shamans do and clinical cases of mania, psychosis that have some unusual features even in shamanism, sometimes insensitivity to pain, this extreme period of prolonged psychomotor agitation, e.g. dancing and dramatic performances, superhuman strength. And now we see this notion that we have to distinguish the would-be shaman, the initiate, from the functioning shaman. Clearly, initiates show periods of confusion, illness, recognized in their own cultures as somehow being severely troubled. They may lose their appetite, quit eating, become passive and withdrawn, or run away, seek solitude in the wilderness as part of their development, speak in somewhat confusing or incoherent ways, and sometimes expose themselves to pain, self-inflicted wounds, walking on fire, whipping, cutting off digits of their fingers, stuff like that, thought to bring pity on them from the spirits and enable them to acquire those relations necessary to cure themselves and become a functioning shaman. So David Whitley has shown that there's evidence that these shamans, or perhaps more appropriately, the shaman initiates, show evidence of a bipolar disorder that sort of parallels these long-standing characteristics of shamanism in terms of Arctic hysteria, reactive psychoses. And even Roger Walsh suggests that the initiatory period can be characterized as an acute psychotic episode that the training ends up resolving. So we have to sort of, on one hand, differentiate the initiate's crises and the formative experience from the qualities of established shamans, and at the same time, find some way to address this notion of the similarities between the psychosis that is often attributed to shamans and what shamans are actually doing. I want to suggest that this lies in endogenous healing responses, and in particular, how it is that psychosis is a sort of a platform from which these healing responses may emerge and enable the person who's undergoing the shamanic initiation to resolve these problems. So psychosis is a kind of inability to resolve crises. And in essence, the shaman is facing a crisis that can only be resolved by accepting the call to become a shaman or facing lifetime persecution by the spirits, perhaps even death. Now, the shaman obviously has this ability to change the dynamic of this illness, and this may not only be part of the ritual activities they engage in, but also this kind of spontaneous healing response or a spontaneous remission of symptoms that often occurs during the premorbid or prodromal periods of early psychoses, in which an enhanced and better off person emerges, sometimes only temporarily before undergoing further decline, but also in times of some, or in cases of some people, resolving the crisis. For instance, people who have profound religious conversions become members of a religious cult. And even though the rest of us think that they might be crazy, within the context of the cult, they can function with a set of beliefs contrary to our normally accepted beliefs about reality, but they go into a stable state of functioning. Now, I want to place this in the context of what Brouwer and Carhart-Harris have presented as a model for understanding the similarities between psychosis and psychedelic healing. And what they propose is that there's a kind of pivotal mental state that is an evolved function for engaging in spontaneous transformations that allow an acute episode of psychotic breakdown to be resolved as a healing and growth response. So these pivotal mental states, they propose, is an evolved function for producing psychological transformations. It's characterized by elevated cortical plasticity, an enhanced capacity for quick associative learning, and an ability to use these to mediate a psychological transformation through rapid and deep learning in response to a crisis. And what they propose is that this involves the relaxation of prior assumptions, the idea that we're now capable of engaging with greater sensitivity and responsivity to new information that's available to us. So what Brouwer and Carhart-Harris propose is that the primers for these pivotal mental states is chronic stress compounded with an acutely stressful event that triggers a multi-level pathway in the serotonergic system. And this includes increased serotonergic receptor signaling, hyperplastic mental states that are produced by this enhanced serotonergic condition that enhances the capacity for associative learning and then mediates the self to a different or higher level of psychological integration. So stress activates this serotonin 2A receptor system that's a specialized system for changing responses to stressful conditions rather than just putting up with them. So the increased availability of serotonin and the enhanced 2A receptor binding is then the mechanism through which changes can occur. And this enhanced serotonin is produced by social isolation, fasting, sleep deprivation, acute pain. Clinical studies that show this. And so what I would propose here is that shamanic practices evolve because we discovered that deliberate induction of these pivotal mental states through specific techniques such as isolation in the wilderness, experiencing extremely fearful conditions, engaging in fasting, engaging in painful austerities, as well as extensive exercise and periods of prolonged sleeplessness, produce these kinds of transformative experiences. I find it very significant that most of these core techniques of shamanic healing involve what would be the natural consequences of being lost for prolonged periods of time in the wilderness, near starvation, physically traumatized, scared to death, and in deep fear of being eaten by animals. So in the case of the shaman, this engages the death and rebirth experience. I'd say a primordial fear of humans living in close contact with nature. The visions of a feared reality produces the stress response that leads to the fragmentation of the ego, and a condition in which the experience of death and being dismembered is really a kind of archetypal drive towards disintegration under stress to allow for a new level of organization to emerge that leads towards a new transcendent identity. And the way shamans do this is through the power animals. They're empowered through incorporating animals as natural symbols for personal identity and individuation, a system within which the shaman now comes to understand something about new powers that are available to them because of the animals that are now available to them as allies and protectors. They become qualities for their new identity, models for attitudes and behavior. And in my shamanism book, I've elaborated on the notion of a hierarchy of self-control, utilizing the animals as kind of social structures and self-structures to create a multi-level system of decision-making or empowerment or emotional focus. So animal identity is one of our innate intelligences, an innate capacity for creating meaning related to some of our innate intellectual capacities that is manifested as totemism, manifested as animal powers. And in the case of shamanism, it's integrated into the normal processes of socialization. It's normal for human beings to unconsciously incorporate significant others, their ideals, their identities, their qualities, their perceptions and expectations for ourselves. We incorporate our parents' models unconsciously into ourselves. What shamanism does is allow the animal power to move into this category of the social other and to be incorporated into the self. So what this leads me to view the animal powers as, and the spirit world in general, as a natural psychology, a variety of neurognostic structures, e.g. archetypes. I've elaborated on this notion in an article called Spirits as Fundamental Structures of Consciousness, and I have elaborated there and in shamanism and elsewhere how we have to view these as biocycle structures of human nature. They reflect complexes of the unconscious. They reflect innate social intelligences. And I think many of the kinds of things that are curiosities and perhaps seen as paradoxes in ongoing psychedelic research, such as where do these DMT entities come from, can be understood as the integration of innate modular intelligences. And so in Journal of Psychedelic Studies, I have an article in 2018 about the ontology of psychedelic entity experiences in evolutionary psychology. I think much of what we have seen as reports of these experiences are not only the same as what we see in shamanic accounts across time, but are also directly corresponding to the way our brain unconsciously functions. So why is shamanic healing cross-cultural? It involves aspects of our innate psychology, ritual, endogenous opioid responses, the effects of altered states of consciousness, and the innate intelligences. I think major aspects of the dynamics of shamanic healing can be understood as the deep hominid adaptation derived from the benefits of collective ritualization, how nighttime rituals that reunify the group, how chanting, drumming, and dancing provide group protection integration, and how community rituals manage emotional processes, particularly those related to a need for a sense of security, as well as enhanced social attachment. So what I'm proposing as a general model for understanding shamanic healing is that what was a central part of human evolution was the acquisition of a series of sickness and healing responses, which are basically evolved capacities that enable us to help others rather than just ourselves. And Fabrega makes a very good set of arguments about not only how sickness and healing responses are uniquely human, not found in our primate cousins, but that they also provide an expansion of mother-infant care, altruism, in which caring and compassion are part of an integrated social and biological adaptation that expanded across hominid evolution to enhance our capacity to keep well the members of our group that we depend upon for survival. And so the biologically rooted sociality that is part of our adaptations as primates, as hominids, and as humans is very important for group functioning. And when it gets disrupted due to illness, we have ritual responses that help resolve these crises. And shamanic ritual does this both at the level of the individual and the group. So community rituals are technologies. Group chanting, drumming, and dancing are social bonding technologies that expand on the endogenous opioid responses, that provide a variety of social, physiological, and emotional coordination processes, and enhancement in neurotransmitter system responses. A lot of good clinical research out there on how chanting and drumming and dancing elicit the opioid response, enhance dopamine responses, can stimulate the serotonergic and adrenergic systems. And so we're getting an enhanced capacity of our neurotransmitter systems to help us deal with problems. I think an important part of shamanic healing has to be understood as placebo effects, hypnotic responses, which are part of the dominant submission dynamic that we see in ape rituals. We need to recognize that these responses and placebo responses are not just imagined kinds of changes. These are the basis of a multi-billion-dollar business in which pharmaceutical companies try to figure out whether or not their drugs are better than a placebo. This is an important capacity for humans that on one hand may be based upon this idea of an enhanced susceptibility to enter into a cognized social reality. That is to say, to view the world from the lens of a powerful person, e.g. the shaman, who can dominate the animals and dominate the evil spirits and dominate the evil sorcerers and allow you to feel empowered and protected. It also is a capacity that may be a significant feature of early human experiences, that is to say, surviving trauma and the dissociative capacities that are associated with the hypnotic response. So I elaborate upon this in shamanism. I'm going to have to keep moving here. I think another important part of the shamanic healing response is mimesis, the ability to communicate through enactment, through behavior, through gestures, through emotions, through pantomime, through show and tell. And mimesis is the basis of coordination in human society. We learn our first dynamics, coordination with our mothers, our parents, or others, from the first days of life through this mimetic system that stimulates endogenous opioid responses, enhances bonding. So it takes what was a mother-infant bonding capacity, expanded through grooming in the primates, and then in the hominid line, this endogenous opioid response was stimulated by the mimetic suite. Drumming, singing, dancing, drama, enactment, all of these dynamics of group integration stimulate the endogenous opioid system. Has to be seen as key to what shamanic healing was designed to do. Of course, shamans do this through drumming as well. Another mammalian adaptation that's very central to chimpanzee displays. But while they make these powerful displays using collective drumming on tree trunks, using hands, using sticks at times, beating on tree trunks, breathing on various objects. Chimps do it for 12 seconds. This is the area for proximal evolutionary development. Shamans do it for 3 or 4 hours at a time. Chimps do it a little bit, stop, a little bit, stop. This is one of the aspects of human evolution, drumming. Very significant capacity I look at in a number of my publications. Music, another aspect of mimesis and an endogenous healing modality, evokes emotional states, elicits the endogenous opioid system, engages in a variety of different kinds of changes in our emotional structures, our emotional responses. It's an effective mechanism for coordinating groups, enhancing emotional modulation, and creating group synchrony, group integration. Dance, another aspect of mimesis, used therapeutically in cultures around the world, elicits many neurotransmitter systems as well as hormonal responses, can provide for various ways of engaging in emotional transformation, and allows for the expression of our body intelligence, our kinesthetic intelligence, that is in a sense also a transformative healing capacity through its ability to allow for expression of emotions, expression of conflicts, expression of unconscious dynamics, and then transforming them through the emotional processes that are liberated through the dance and the self-expression. So it's a mechanism for allowing an ancient body-based expressive modality that stimulates psychological integration. So what we can see in the dance and the drama of the shaman is a way of changing our habitus, our ingrained emotional and behavioral dynamics that then can be transformed through the expressive modalities of dance. We should see dance as a psychotechnology that enhances our neurotransmitter system, enhances affective linkages with the groups, enhances the psychosocial dimensions of bonding and well-being with other members of our society. So shamanic altered states of consciousness have to be seen as a key aspect of shamanic healing. I just list here all these different aspects that are key to shamanism and induce altered states: ritual, drumming, fasting, austerities, the sacred medicines, the visionary experiences, the relationships with animals, animal transformation, death and rebirth experiences. All these are key features of altered states that have, on one hand, simple methods for inducing them, shamanic technologies, and on the other hand, profound psychophysiological changes that I elaborated on in shamanism. I think that we can see that there is an evolved biological basis for altered states of consciousness, an exaptation of the dream capacity, which I will skip over here, the effects of trauma, which are replicated in ritual. We see various kinds of experiences that emerge under the near-death experiences that provide a variety of adaptive responses, including stress modulation, relaxation, endogenous opioid responses. The extreme running and the runner's high is also a piece of the puzzle here, because they induce mystical states. I elaborate upon this in shamanism. And then the effects of the natural psychedelics. We have to consider all of these as part of our evolved capacity for inducing altered states that lead to a variety of transformative experiences because they induce a particular kind of brain dynamic. I refer to this as the psycho-integration of the brain, the integrative mode of consciousness. In a number of my publications, I contend a common pattern of altered states is synchronized theta waves emerging out of the serotonergic circuitry that links the brainstem with the frontal limbic areas, with the frontal cortex, activates the temporal lobes and emotional systems, synchronizes the frontal cortex, and produces a synthesis of the behavioral brain, emotional brain, and our cognitive brain. Just here, I will say that, in shamanism, and particularly in my book, Culture and Health, I look at the therapeutic effects of altered states of consciousness, the evidence that therapeutic responses are enhanced by the relaxation response, by accessing unconscious information, the extinction of learned patterns of behavior that occurs through transmarginal inhibition, visualization, the opioid release, serotonergic modulation through ritual and ritual dynamics, and ultimately a variety of psychoneuroimmunological effects, all derived from altered states of consciousness, which have to be seen as part of why the shaman's crises can be resolved through ritual that induces altered states and leads to healing conditions. Shaman work involves dream time. I'm just going to skip over these slides here. I have this in the book. We have an enhanced capacity for using this mammalian adaptation by engaging in rituals that incorporate our intentions into dream processes. Jung's notions of active imagination are very appropriate here, but no time to go over them. A lot of ideas about why dream works may heal that you'll have to look at in some of my other publications. I want to just briefly touch here, my last 5 minutes before I got to stop, on the dopaminergic personality. Fred Previck talks about, dopamine and human evolution. Dreaming is dopaminergic. There's a variety of ritual activities that enhance dopamine, such as dance and other things that stimulate first the serotonergic and endocannabinoid systems that also can have feed-forward effects on the dopaminergic responses. And elevated dopamine produces many of the characteristics associated with shamans, and certainly, and its positive emotions and sense of bonding and affiliation with the animal spirits. It's enhanced coping and stress tolerance, the inhibition of negative emotions are all things that dopamine does and can all enhance our response to stress and conditions of mental illness by resolving them with a higher level of dopamine. So dopamine enhances a variety of different cognitive processes. They can also be seen as important tools for reworking through the problems that one may encounter. And so the cognitive effects can be seen as contributing to processes that engage in active resolution of the crises that, in the case of the shaman, may produce the psychotic break. And then the shamans have all kinds of characteristics of highly dopaminergic minds. In a couple of publications, Fred Previck elaborates upon this. I've addressed it primarily in my book, Shamanism, but the idea here is that these excessive levels of dopamine can be important contributions to a different mental state that enables a troubled person to confront the crises that they face and find ways to resolve the problems. So there's many different aspects of altered states that can be seen as adaptive. Indeed, I would contend that what we call altered states of consciousness was a series of adaptations that engaged in techniques to provide enhanced access to what's normally unconscious information, and that the integration of different brain systems, enhanced capacity for learning and unlearning, information integration exemplified in visions, and viewing visions not as hallucinations, but as a symbolic image system, allows us to understand how these altered states provide tools for engaging an enhanced capacity to deal with our own unconscious potentials. So what are the contemporary implications of shamanism? It's part of our evolved psychology that altered states are natural processes that engage the encounter with, incorporation of adaptive cognitive states, particularly in the visions that are produced that provide both processes for psychological integration and information that allows us to understand what we need to address. That ritual activity, drumming, dancing, the whole mimetic suite is a technology for altering consciousness. It does through the endogenous opioids, through physical stimulation on the brain, and produces a variety of different kinds of physiological effects that are inherently therapeutic. In essence, a kind of enhanced psychointegration. So if we're going to use ritual to transform consciousness, the shamanic journey is a journey to the unconscious, to the unincorporated aspects of the self, an ability to develop an awareness of our unconscious intelligences, to acquire assistance in enhancing ourself through the integration of these unconscious intelligences, exemplified in the animal powers the shaman encounters, the healing energies that they experience, and the enhanced innate cognitive processes that are engaged through the mimetic suite, particularly song and dance. So I've elaborated upon all of these ideas in shamanism, and everything with the exception of the pivotal mental states are covered there, and in some of my most recent articles, that are available on ResearchGate. So I'm sorry I had to rush through all this, but I'm going to be able to finish here on my 45-minute timeline.